Hey folks, how's it going? My name is Dustin Smith. I'm with A2K, with Allegiance to the King, and today we're going to be talking about the state of the dead. Our topic today is that the dead are sleeping in their graves. There are a lot of people that think that the dead are actually alive somewhere else. There are many funeral sermons that indicate that the dead are actually alive in heaven, presumably. But is this actually what the Bible teaches? We're actually going to see that the Bible teaches something different. It's going to teach that the dead are asleep in their graves and they are awaiting resurrection. This euphemism of sleep is constantly used throughout the Bible, through the Old and the New Testament, to describe the state of those who have died. Okay? The best passage to start out in looking at this topic is Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2. In Daniel 12:2, it says, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." That's Daniel 12 and verse 2. Very clearly, it talks about what people are doing. They are sleeping, where they're doing it, in the dust of the ground, and what's going to happen to them. They are going to awaken, okay? Some to everlasting life, some to the life of the age to come, and others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. But there, people are dead. They are sleeping in their graves, in the dust of the ground, and they are going to awaken in resurrection. That's Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2. Clearly there, sleep is used as a metaphor, as a euphemism to describe death. This is not unfamiliar to us today because there are many graves and tombstones that say R.I.P., rest in peace. It's a common way that we describe death. Death is resting and sleeping. But this is not only spoken of in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2. Actually, the phrase sleep or sleeping or falling asleep shows up over 60 times in the Bible, both in the Old and New Testament, to describe the state of death. Obviously, we can't look at all of those references today, so let's just look at a handful of them. Let's look in Psalm 13 and verse 3. All right, we're here in Psalm 13 and verse 3, where David, the psalmist, says, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God, enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death." That's Psalm 13 and verse 3, where David specifically talks about death, and he describes it as the sleep of death, namely the euphemism for dying and staying unconscious in the grave. He describes it as sleep, specifically the sleep of death. Okay, now we can look at David. We know that when David died, the writer of Kings describes David as someone who fell asleep. We can see this in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 10. All right, so here in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 10, it says, "Then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David." 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 10, David slept as he was buried with his fathers. He was buried in a grave, and he is described here as sleeping with his ancestors. That means that he died and he was sleeping the sleep of death. Now, that's David. David was considered overall a good king, okay? But what about bad kings? What about the bad people? Let's look at another king, 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 8, because this description of sleep describing those who have died is something that is used both of the righteous and of the unrighteous. 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 8 describes the king Abijam, and Abijam slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David. Okay, just like we saw with King David, here we can have an evil king. He's described as an evil king in verse 3 of this particular chapter. He also slept with his ancestors as he was buried, okay? So it's used of righteous people and of unrighteous people. Now you might think, okay, yeah, I see that in the Old Testament. I see that in the Hebrew Bible, but certainly the New Testament must say something different. Maybe the New Testament talks about how we have immortal souls that go off to heaven or hell once we die. Is this really what we see in the New Testament? Let's look at the primary teacher of the New Testament, namely Jesus Christ. Look at what Jesus says in John chapter 11, verses 11 through 14. Here we go, starting off in verse 11. "This he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep." Verse 12. "The disciples then said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Verse 13. "Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. That's John 11, verses 11 through 14. Very clearly there, Jesus distinguishes the type of sleep that he is talking about in regard to Lazarus. Jesus says in verse 11, Lazarus has fallen asleep. The disciples think that he's talking about literal sleep, as in what we do at night once we go to bed. But Jesus was speaking in verse 13. He had spoken of his death. And so Jesus clarifies, as a good teacher, verse 14, Lazarus is dead. Okay? So Lazarus is asleep, verse 11, and Lazarus is dead, verse 14. So even Jesus himself believed and taught this metaphor that sleep is likened unto death. Sleep being a metaphor and a euphemism for those who have died. Okay? And he clarifies here to make sure that we know the difference. Okay? So this is something that Jesus taught. Let's look in Acts chapter 7 and verse 60. Acts chapter 7 is the famous speech of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, arguably. Acts chapter 7 and verse 60 says, Then falling on his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, saying, Lord, do not hold this sin against him. Having said this, he fell asleep, meaning he died. Okay? He died as a martyr, but it's described here as Stephen falling asleep. That's Acts chapter 7 and verse 60. So this is written by Luke, the author of the book of Acts. So we can see that Jesus taught this. We can see that Luke taught this. And we're also going to see that the apostle Paul taught that death is likened unto sleep. Okay? So 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is where Paul talks about the resurrection. So resurrection from the dead seems to be a great place to talk about what is the state of the dead, namely those who are asleep. So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. He says in verse 4, And he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep, meaning some have died. Some of these people still remain today, these eyewitnesses of the resurrection, but some of them, of course, have died. And Paul describes those who have died as those who have fallen asleep. That's 1 Corinthians 15, verses 4 through 6. So, we can see that this is an Old Testament teaching and it's a New Testament teaching. We can see that it refers to the righteous and to the unrighteous. We can see this is something that Jesus taught, this is something that was taught by Luke, and this is something that was taught by Paul. This is an easy thing for us to see. Again, over 60 times within the Bible, death is likened unto sleep, meaning the people that have died are dead, they're unconscious in their graves, and they will come alive when they are raised from the dead. Okay? Hopefully this has helped you to understand what the dead are doing and how this phrase sleeping is used in the Bible in accordance to allegiance to the teachings of Jesus. Remember, Jesus himself taught this in John chapter 11. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share if you want more videos on biblical topics from Allegiance to the King from A2K. My name is Dustin Smith. Until next time, you folks take care.